We have been discussing skepticism, so let's get back to that. I'm looking around this room and seeing very few of you here today. What's going on? Everybody figures, hey, it's impossible to know anything, so he doesn't know anything, so we don't have to go to class. That's actually a pretty powerful argument. Well done, Peter. All right. So, today we're going to start by talking about Zhuangzi. We mentioned him a little bit last time. He's an ancient Chinese sage, a philosopher who in the Taoist tradition challenges the possibility of knowledge. He ends up arguing that there is no way to know anything. And as Zhu Xi said, Lao Tzu still wanted to do something, but Zhuangzi didn't want to do anything at all. He really thought there was no point, because after all, it was impossible to know anything. And if it's impossible to know anything, he thought, it was really impossible to have any firm ground for action. Why do you do various things you do? Well, because, the argument goes, you know certain things. You go to, let's say, Taco Cabana to get something for lunch because you know they sell food. If you didn't have that knowledge, there wouldn't be much point to the action. And so the thought is that if you don't really have any knowledge, then there really isn't any ground, any reason for doing anything at all. Well, he gives a number of arguments in favor of skepticism, some of which really have echoes throughout other parts of the skeptical tradition, and others of which are much more distinctive to Zhuangzi. One of them is the interdependence of the objective and the subjective. And we'll talk about more about that in a moment. Another is the unity of everything, a specifically Taoist premise. One is an argument from variability, one is the problem of the criterion, and one is the possibility of dreaming. So I'm going to talk about the first two only very quickly because they're things that are really only appearing in Zhuangzi. But the other three are fundamental arguments, in fact maybe the most fundamental arguments of skeptical traditions, not just in China, but in ancient Greece and everywhere else. So let's start with this argument about the objective and the subjective. In a way, it's a very simple point, and it's connected to Philo's argument from comparison. The idea is that there's no way to distinguish what's really objective knowledge of the world from what is purely a subjective impression of the world. We can't tell, in other words, what about our own impressions is really due to the nature of reality and what is being supplied by other sources. So he says, is it possible to become completely objective about something, to have a completely objective view about really anything at all, about the existence of God, about which political candidate is best, about which team is likely to win, about where will serve you the best lunch, etc. Can you be completely objective about this? Well, he says no. And here's the reason. Subjectivity and objectivity are inevitably intertwined. They really connect fundamentally. Suppose you thought you had an objective view of something, a purely objective view. What could it be based on but your own impressions, your own subjective states of mind with respect to it? So anything we would take to be an object of knowledge really has to rest in the end on something subjective. Our own impressions, our own, not just the evidence you might say, but our own impressions of the evidence, our own subjective states on how we think about the evidence. And moreover, you might say, if the objective relies on the subjective in that way, if the subjective relies on the objective. If I have a particular preference, let's say that's purely subjective, then it's an objective fact about me that I do that. I love, for example, sauerkraut. And that's a preference, but it's an objective fact about me that I do love sauerkraut. And in fact, one of my fondest memories from my childhood is my grandfather's basement, where he used to make his own sauerkraut. He grew cabbage and put it in big vats in the basement. And to most people, that's a really disgusting smell as the cabbage transforms into sauerkraut. But on the other hand, I was around that enough as a kid that now if I smell that smell, it's like Grandma and Grandpa's house. It's wonderful. And so that's something that is in a way an objective fact about me, but it rests on my own subjective states of mind. And so subjectivity and objectivity are really interconnected, he says. So in the end, we can't really distinguish them. Now, I'm not sure that follows, by the way. Even if two things are intertwined, is it the case that we can't distinguish them? Suppose you've got clothing that consists of the mixture of fabrics, like an Oxford cloth shirt, let's say, that has blue fabric and white fabric interwoven. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't distinguish blue from white. And so we want to be careful about that conclusion. I think the way to put it most strongly, in a sense, is to just say, look, anything we call objective really has to rest on this subjective foundation. And there's no way to get outside of ourselves to find out whether that subjectivity that it rests on has any greater validity than our own particular states of mind. So if we think about the argument primarily in that direction, that objectivity has to rest on subjectivity, and that subjectivity really, in the end, has no, you might say, path for us to get outside of ourselves and see it from outside to find out whether it's nearly subjective. That seems to me a fairly powerful argument. His argument about the unity of everything is really just a way of saying all distinctions are distinctions we draw. They're distinctions we draw in reality. And so he says, in the end, really all things are identical. There's just stuff happening. And we draw distinctions among various things. So imagine that you were watching a movie. And this movie didn't have ordinary characters in it. Actually, last night I watched Cabaret for the first time. I was actually in high school when it came out. Everybody around me loved Cabaret and so on. I had never seen it. So finally, my wife said, you really got to see it, so I watched it. And I hated it every moment, actually. but forget that. There are things that happen, right? There are individual characters and so on, and so you can think, yeah, look, it comes to mind up. But suppose it was a sort of modernistic movie that was just color swirls, and that was all I was seeing, okay? And this color swirl movie, you might be thinking, well, how would you react to that? You might find objects in it. You might find things. In fact, in the communication school here, they actually have a film competition. And one year, I was a judge. And there were lots of films that were like that. People made them, not by pointing a camera at anything, but by just taking film and doing art. And so they would do for a variety of things. And I found out that my own judgments about these things diverged radically from the art faculty, so I've never been asked back. I was the dissenting voice. The things they loved, I was just kind of like, yeah, I get it. And the things they hated were the things I said, I thought this was a brilliant commentary on 20th century totalitarianism and blah, blah, blah. And they would look at me like I was insane. But what was I doing? I was looking at these various shapes and swirls and thinking, ooh, all right, that's a stormy future. Those are clearly train tracks going to the gulag. This, blah, 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 blah. What was I doing? I was reading objects. I was reading some kind of meaning into this. Well, the Taoist says, look, that's what we're doing with the world all the time. The world is, in effect, just this big swirling mass of colors, shapes, sounds, and so on, and we carve it up into objects. We're the ones who are drawing the distinctions between this and that. And so in the end, really, all that's purely subjective. It's something our minds are doing. It's not something that comes pre-packaged for us in the world. So the Taoist says, reject distinctions, take refuge in the Tao, place yourself in subjective relations to things, which means, in other words, you can talk about how things seem to you, but don't talk about how they are. All those distinctions, what you call this and that chair, this table, this person, and so on, all of that is something you're imposing on the world. And so give up all those claims to objectivity. Well, those are distinctive to Zhuangzi, and I think those arguments really rest on a certain kind of metaphysical view. But there are other arguments he gives that aren't quite like that. This, however, is one that is meant to illustrate the point about putting yourself in subjective relation to externals, and also in a way is a nice lead into the next argument. He says, a keeper of monkeys said with regard to their rations of chestnuts that each monkey was to have 3 in the morning and 4 at night. At this, the monkeys were very angry. So the keeper said they might have 4 in the morning and 3 at night, with which arrangement they were all well pleased. Now, that's supposed to be, I don't know what that's supposed to be. I find it funny, but here's the idea. I mean, look, jokes don't come along that often in philosophy. You've got to appreciate them where they pop off, right? All right, silly monkey. I mean, this is sort of funny. Well, anyway, you look at this and you think, okay, it's a question of your subjective relation. In a sense, the facts are the same, right? They're getting 7 chestnuts a day. It's a question of their own reaction to that, the reaction varying. But it leads us to the next point, which is really reactions do vary. Different people react to the world in different ways. Different people see things in different ways. And so it leads us nicely to the argument for variability. Zhuangzi introduces it in this way by asking the question, do you know what you don't know? Donald Rumsfeld at one point was talking about the known knowns, the known unknowns, but then the scariest part, the unknown unknowns, the things you don't know, but you don't know that you don't know them, and you don't realize you should be thinking about them. And so he's really saying, yeah, do we know what we don't know? Are there known unknowns, or maybe there are unknown unknowns, things we don't know and we don't even realize that we don't know them and they matter. Anyway, here is where he introduces this idea of variability. I'd ask you this: if a man sleeps in a damp place, he gets lumbago and dies. But how about a meal? And living up in a tree is precarious and trying the nerves. But what about monkeys? Of the man, the eel, the monkey, whose habitat is the right one? Absolutely. Well, here's the idea. Different species like to live in different places. Different people like to live in different places. Some people like small houses. Some people like big houses. Some people like apartments. Some people like to live on the streets and so forth. And so there are lots and lots of different ways of having preferences about this, which is the right one. Or here, what about beauty? He said, men admire Mao Chang and Li Ji, at the sight of whom fishes plunge deep down into the water, birds soar high in the air, and deer hurry away. Yet who shall say which is the correct standard of beauty? So different species presumably evaluate beauty in very different ways. Different people evaluate it in different ways. Here is how Sextus Empiricus, in a very different tradition, puts the same sort of argument. He says, according to the mode, that is to say the argument really, deriving from dispute, we find that undecidable dissension about the matter proposed has come in both ordinary life and among philosophers. Because of this, we're not able either to choose or to rule out anything, and we end up with suspension of judgment. So here's the idea. People see things in different ways. Our impressions of things vary, and our opinions about things vary. Our preferences vary. Who's right and who's wrong? He says it's a matter of undecidable dissension. That is to say, there's no way to tell who's right and who's wrong. And so we get the argument from variability. It has, I think, two premises. The first premise is one about variability. Things are perceived differently by different beings at different times. People have different opinions about things at different times. I shouldn't even just limit it to people, because this can be variation among species, variations among members of species, like people. It can be the same person at different times. Hence, by the way, Philo's argument from drunkenness. Is the world as you perceive it when you're drunk, or as you perceive it when you're sober? Well, that's the same being, but at different times. The key premise, however, is the second one, undecidability. There's no way to tell who's right. Okay? There is no neutral way to determine whose perceptions, whose opinions are accurate. And so in the end, the conclusion is knowledge is impossible. There are all sorts of different ways of seeing things. They disagree. We have no way of sorting out which one is the most trustworthy. So there's no way to know which one is correct. So knowledge is impossible. Now, what do you think of that argument? How good an argument is that? Yeah.
Well, aren't there certain things where everyone would see it that way for most people?
Okay, good. So one thing you could say is, well, wait a minute. Yes, things are perceived differently by people, and so there are differences in perceptions. On the other hand, there are things about which people broadly agree. For example, suppose we brought people into this room and said, are there chairs in this room? Maybe some people would see it differently and say no. Or at least, I'll put it more neutrally. Seats. Are there seats in this room? Are there places to sit down? Presumably, people are going to overwhelmingly agree. Or look at the color of your shirt. It's orange. And if we bring a lot of people together and say, what's the color of his shirt? Presumably, overwhelmingly, they're going to say orange. Now, there might be other colors that they would disagree about. Maybe if we looked at these walls and said, what are they? There would be some disagreement. Or we said, what's the predominant color of these chairs? There would be disagreement. But there are going to be lots of things where we don't disagree. Or how about this? 2 plus 2 is 4. Good. We're not going to find some people saying, oh, 4. And others saying, well, no, I think it's 5. Some saying 4.3. And no, there's not going to be variation about those things. So, first of all, you might think, look, that variability premise is going to come up sometimes. Now, where is it strongest? Where do we really find people disagreeing most? Yeah?
Moral questions?
Ooh, good, moral questions. And even there's large areas of agreement, right? Suppose we just have somebody gratuitously murdering somebody else and say, right or wrong. Very few people are going to say, oh, I think that was the right thing to do. And so, in general, there's going to be large areas of agreement there, but still there will be some moral beliefs, right, where there is strong disagreement. So that's one place we'll find serious disagreement of a kind we don't really find in arithmetic, for example, or in identifications of colors. What are some other areas where there might be lots of disagreement? Yeah.
Perception of art.
Okay, good. Perception of art. Notice he uses judgments about beauty. And so evaluation of what is beautiful, whether this is a good movie or not a good movie, whether this is a good work of art and so on, those are things people disagree about a lot. Yeah. Religion, that's another area. So notice some of those things we brought up as potential areas where you might be a skeptic is precisely where that variability premise is strongest. And in those areas too, the undecidability premise seems strongest. Because after all, if we had a good way of deciding, presumably we'd just use it, right? But if people are disagreeing about the morality of abortion, or whether or not there's a God, or about whether or not Cabaret is a good movie, then you might say, well, what's the neutral way we have of sorting this out, determining who's right? And there might be no neutral way. In fact, that's why the disagreement persists. So, we could say, right, how do we really know then who's portraying things accurately? And we might think, well, what if we did have a method? Wouldn't it be great if we had a technique? So we could say, hey, listen, whenever there's this kind of disagreement, let's just submit it to the test. Now, there have been various people throughout history who thought there could be such a test. Leibniz thought there could be. He looked for a universal language into which you can translate any dispute and figure out who was right and who was wrong. Not just about arithmetic, for example, or about scientific questions, but about morality, about art, about religion, about anything. There would be this ars combinatorial, this grand combinatorial art where we'd be able to pose any question and get an answer out of this sort of machine. Well, it's a powerful idea, but suppose we had some method like that, some criterion, some machine, something that would give us an answer. That, in a way, just generates another problem. So here is how Zhuangzi puts a problem that is now known as the problem of the criterion. And I've got a picture of Sextus there, but it's actually Zhuangzi's words. I screwed up. Who shall I employ as arbiter between us? If I employ someone who takes your view, we'll side with you. How can such a one arbitrate between us? If, on the other hand, I take somebody who has my view, he'll side with me. That person can't arbitrate between us. If I employ someone who either differs from or agrees with both of us, he'll be unable to decide between us. So in short, he's saying, who's going to be referee? It's a bit like the situation that happened actually when I was on a softball team for the philosophy department at the University of Pittsburgh. But that's already funny, like, right? Philosophers playing softball. You can just imagine the things that go wrong. And here's one of the things that didn't go wrong. By the way, near the end of the season, we actually won a game. I don't know how it happened, but we won a game. And afterwards, we went to this bar we used to go to all the time to drink a beer at the end of the game. And everybody just sat there glumly for about 20 minutes until somebody said, why are we just sitting here silently? We won. And somebody else said, because there's nobody to blame. Usually we went there and drank a beer and blamed each other. They're like, we would have won if only we hadn't dropped that ball at third base. Well, if you only hadn't hit into another play, blah, 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 blah. That's what we did. So anyway, but back to the problem that emerged from our philosophical natures. We were playing the MBAs. And so these business school students are there, and they were much better than we were. But this guy is up the plate, two runners on base. He hits a long fly ball down the right field line. Well, this is an intramural field. There were no actual foul lines marked. And it ended up hitting a light post out there. And so nobody caught it. And we were like, and he runs around the bases. So he's cheering, home run. We said, foul ball, foul ball. That pole is in foul territory. But it was really very close to where the line would have been. And so it's kind of like, I don't know whether that pole is in foul territory or fair territory. What should we call it? Well, of course, the MBAs were all saying, it was a home run, it was a home run. And we were all saying, no, it was a foul ball, it was a foul ball. Well, now, what would you do in such a circumstance? Notice there was nobody to appeal to as a arbiter. There was no umpire. There was nobody we could point to who would be sort of neutral. All the people on the one team said it was a home run. All the people on the other team said it was a foul ball. And so there was no neutral observer to appeal to. You can maybe imagine what happened. The business school people trained in negotiation said, how about if we call it a ground rule double? I immediately said, that's fair. But one of the philosophers said, no, it's not a double. That makes no sense at all. It's either a home run or a foul ball. It can't be a double. And the other philosophers nodded, except for me. And so, of course, the MBA said, okay, we agree with you. That's a home run. And that was only one of the reasons they beat us that day. But anyway, it was a sort of silly example, maybe, of this problem. There was no umpire. There was nobody who was a neutral arbiter. Anybody on the one team was going to say it was a home run. Anybody on the other team was going to say it was a foul ball. There was no way to sort it out. And here's the way that Sextus himself puts this. He calls it the mode of infinite regress. He says what's brought forward as a source of conviction for the matter proposed itself needs another such source, which itself needs another, and so on ad infinitum. So we have no point from which to begin to establish anything in suspension of judgment follows. Here's the idea. Suppose we had either some guy we all point to and say, aha, let's say the philosophy department points to somebody who's wandering by and says, you hit that pole fair or foul? Why do we trust that kind of judgment, right? Surely we'd have to have some reason for thinking that person was neutral and that that person could be relied on as a fair arbiter between us. If it's a question of a principle or a criterion, we'd want to say, well, why is that the right principle? Why is that the right criterion? There could be lots of principles, lots of criteria. What if we had Leibniz's machine and we put the problem to it? We said, Leibniz, is it fair or foul? And he runs the machine and it spits out. It's not going to spit out ground rule double, I guess. It spits out home run. Okay? Why should we trust the machine? The philosophers then would have said, we don't trust this machine. This isn't the right machine. It's not programmed correctly. It should have said foul ball. And so in short, we'd have to have some reason for thinking that was the right criterion, the right machine, the right person to appeal to, etc. But how would we do that? We'd need to have some principle for choosing principles or machines or judges or something like that. And where could we get it? If we got one, well, it's only one of many possible criteria. So where would we get a criterion for it? How could we justify it? And so on. So here's a way of framing the problem of the criterion. There is no neutral way to tell which perceptions or opinions ought to be trusted. That's the undecidability premise we had in the variability argument. But then we'd say, look, what we need to solve this problem is precisely a neutral way, a criterion for telling us which perceptions to trust. And so you could view this argument as a challenge. Give me a criterion. Give me a method for sorting out which perceptions ought to be trusted. But where could we get it is the first problem. And secondly, if we could, how could we justify it? It would be one of only many possible criteria. And so we'd need some justification. Well, if we had one, we'd need another criterion in terms of which it could be justified. So in short, we could justify our judgment. For example, if it was a foul ball by appeal to this criterion. For example, if the pole is in foul territory. But of course, the other side is going to dispute our criteria. They're going to say, no, the pole is in fair territory. And so, how do we sort out that question? We need some independent criteria for what constitutes a fair ball or a foul ball. But then, as soon as we introduce that, somebody can say, well, why is that the right criterion for deciding the question of whether the pole is in fair or foul territory? And it looks like either we have to go in a circle and at some point have a criteria that just says I'm the right criterion, which doesn't seem very convincing, or in the end, we've got to go to an infinite regress. We need a criterion, a criteria, a criteria, a criteria, and so on. And so either way, we end up unable to justify our knowledge. Oh, and there I have a little slide about the logic of these arguments. I'm going to skip it because I think you all look tired at the end of the week, and it'll just make you much more tired. But if you're interested in the math or the logic behind this, you can look at that slide. I want to get to the more fun argument. This is, in a way, a particular version of the variability argument, but it's a fun version of it, and one that's really, in a certain sense, much more sweet. It's an argument from the possibility of dreaming. How do you know right now that you are awake? Yeah?
Because I remember everything that's happening.
Because you remember things. Ah, okay, good. You might think, look, I can tell whether I'm dreaming or whether I'm awake, because right now, gee, I can remember everything that happened. For example, exactly 5 minutes and 20 seconds ago, you said, oh, I have no idea whether you're right, because I don't remember. But in short, we could say, look, you know, I remember things more clearly in waking life, right? I could try the cartoon character method of pitching myself. How else might I distinguish dreams from waking life? Yeah?
Like irrational, like weird things aren't happening, you know, like in dreams, like, you know, your mom pops up out of nowhere, just like, oh, that's happening.
All right, good. Things in this classroom seem to be going in a pretty normal way. It's not like people who weren't here suddenly appeared, or that I turned into some frog, or that, bizarre things happen, and those things do happen in dreams. I mean, I find in my dreams, I'm in one place talking to these people, all of a sudden, I'm in this different place talking to other people, yet strangely in the dream, I have this sense that somehow nothing has really changed. And there's something bizarre about that, right? And waking life isn't like that. Yeah?
When I ponder if I'm dreaming, while I'm dreaming, I realize that I'm dreaming. But if I do it while I'm awake, I realize I'm not dreaming.
Oh, if you think about this very question when you're awake, you conclude that you're awake. If you think about this question, could you dream about the argument from dreaming? And what would you think if you were? Would you think, wait a minute, I know that I'm dreaming. Actually, I've had dreams in which I have the sense that I'm dreaming, and then that I wake up. And then the alarm goes off, and I realize, oh wait, I was having a dream within a dream. I was dreaming that I was dreaming, right? And I woke up from the dream in the dream, but I was still dreaming. Anyway, that's a kind of weird higher order dream, but it's the kind of thing that starts worrying Zhuangzi. He says, those who dream of the banquet wake to lamentation and sorrow. Those who dream of lamentation and sorrow wake to join the hunt. While they dream, they don't know that they dream. Some will even interpret the very dream they're dreaming, and only when they awake do they know it's a dream. So even if sometimes we might be aware of dreaming, especially when we're in that state where we're sort of caught between sleep and wakefulness, nevertheless, most of the time we're dreaming, and we aren't thinking at the time, oh, I'm dreaming, right? Maybe you do at some point. Maybe something's chasing you, and you find you're unable to move, and you think, luckily, I'm just dreaming. But probably not, and probably if you do, it's just as you're waking up. So, here is the most poetic statement of this problem. He says, I, Zhuangzi, once upon a time, dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither to all intents and purposes a butterfly. I was conscious only of following my fancies as a butterfly, and I was unconscious of my individuality as a man. Suddenly I waked, and there I lay myself again. Now, I don't know whether I was then a man dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I'm now a butterfly dreaming he's a man. Okay, that's actually a very powerful challenge. It's not just how do you know you're awake right now? After all, maybe you fell asleep in your room thinking, oh, I better wake up in time for class. And this is your subconscious mind expressing your guilt about missing class by pretending you're there, okay? So there's that problem. But also this problem. How do you know that your dream life isn't your real life and all of this is just a dream? Yeah?
Are there people that suggest that dreams are actually an interpretation of a higher power, a more involved version of the world in your life?
Oh, well, all right, yeah. Suppose we thought about the nature of dreams. We might think that there are criteria for deciding what's a dream and what's wakefulness that we can tell from within. But you also could think, well, maybe dreams are doing something specific. And people have had all sorts of theories. Freud thinks dreams are wish fulfillments, or at least attempts in the final theory at wish fulfillment. Other people have said, no, that a dream is really just the mind engaging in filing and taking various things that have popped up over the last few days and putting them in the right slots in long-term memory. But you could have this more spiritual view of dreams. You could say, no, it's a window into another reality. You really are living those lives in your dreams. It's just that there's no direct path between. So, have you ever had a dream where you recognize the place? I've had this sense. There's a house in the dream, and I go up to the house and I have this sense that this is a very familiar place, that I've been there before, and that I know this. And then I wake up and think about that house and think, I've never seen anything remotely like that. I have no idea what that was. Maybe that's evidence that really you do have a kind of continuous life in another spiritual dimension that is revealed in your dreams. I'm not advocating that view, but suppose you thought that. Then you think, ooh, wait a minute, how do I know that there isn't this independent reality and that I really am whatever I dream myself to be? Whether it's a butterfly or a Chinese peasant, farmer, or I don't know. In my dreams, insofar as I can remember them, actually, I've been taking melatonin to help me sleep. It makes your dreams more vivid, so I've been remembering them more. And my dreams are unbelievably dull. I'm mostly sitting in faculty meetings to talk about but sometimes I have a dream which is more interesting than that. But then, actually, I don't know anything about myself. Right? I'm sort of doing these things and going to these places that feel familiar and yet aren't. And it's never really revealed to me who I am or what I'm doing or anything about me. So I don't know who I am in those dreams. Yeah.
Like nightmares. I personally have nightmares are like crushed by steel and I die. So like if your dreams like your real life and you die in suffering, this, you know, it's
Ooh, yeah. She's saying, what about nightmares? What about a nightmare where, let's say, you were crushed by steel, or you fall off a cliff, or some horrible monster is chasing you, or something terrible is happening, somebody comes at you with a knife, and you actually die in the dream. Maybe you die in the dream, or maybe you just wake up as you're about to be killed. But whatever happens, you might think, well, gosh, what's going on there? Surely there can't be a continuous life elsewhere in these dreams. Well, what if there are many continuous lives? You just lost one. Nightmares. You just died in that dream world. Why is there many dream worlds? Well, anyway, again, I'm not advocating this view, but how do we know that's not the case? So, anyway, you can see this image of Zhuangzi the butterfly has had a big impact. Here is a sort of a Chinese drawing that is sort of depicting him asleep and dreaming of the butterfly. Here is how Descartes puts the same word. He says, in my sleep, I experience the same things as madmen do when they're awake, or sometimes even less probable things. How often have I been persuaded in the quiet of the night of familiar things, that I was here in my robe, sitting by the fire, when in fact I was lying disrobed between the sheets. He says, it certainly seems to me now that I'm looking at this paper with waking eyes, that this head I move is not asleep, that I deliberately and knowingly extend my hand and feel it. What happens in sleep isn't so distinct, no doubt, as if I don't remember being tricked while asleep by similar thoughts on other occasions. So, by the way, what I've translated there as no doubt is something that, it's in either the French or the Latin phrase that's like, as if it's sort of, I was trying to render it into something that is kind of colloquial English, but in fact it's sort of just this expression of, yeah, right. You think there's a criterion, well then why am I ever fooled into taking dreams as real and really being frightened? After all, if I'm in a nightmare and something's chasing me, why don't I just think, it's a dream, it's cool. I don't, because I don't realize at the time that I'm asleep. And so he says, while I think about this more carefully, I see plainly that there are no certain indications by which we may clearly distinguish being awake from being asleep. I'm dumbfounded, and my astonishment almost persuades me that I am asleep. Now this brings us to the trump card, the biggest argument, you might say, on the agenda here, on Descartes' list of arguments. It's something that he introduces new to this tradition, but in a way there have been a variety of variants on it, all of which are meant to say, look, even when I'm asleep, there might be certain things that are true, but we can adopt a hypothesis that's even more radical. Suppose in charge of the universe is not a good God, or just a set of scientific laws, or whatever you might think, but instead an evil deceiver. This evil deceiver is someone who is out to trick you, out to get you cognitively, wants to give you false beliefs about not just this or that thing, like that you're awake or that you're asleep, or that you are a student at the University of Texas or something else, but about anything at all. This can make you doubt even logic, even mathematics. Presumably in your dreams, 1 + 1 is there too. Either, you're running down the hallway in the dream or you're not. So logic, mathematics still work in dreams. But what if there were an evil deceiver out to trick you? He says, I shall suppose, just for the purposes of doubt, he says, I am going to suppose not that God is supremely good, the fountain of truth, but some evil genius of the greatest power and cunning who has employed all his energies to deceive you. So imagine that there's a being in charge of the universe that is out to trick you. Okay? It might be by creating this virtual reality that is not the true reality at all. It might be by having your brain skip a beat every time it thinks about anything. So you think, well, I remember very clearly that this morning I did such and such, and the brain just clicks in such a way that you misremember. Or suppose, right now you say, I know just a moment ago we talked about the argument from dreaming, but suppose it's not true. Suppose the evil demon has put that fiction into your mind, given you a false memory, has in fact gone and made something go wrong. Or you're thinking 1 + 1 is 2, and something goes wrong. It's not 2. It's just that you think it's 2 because the evil deceiver has made your mind go. Now, this might make you think something terrible. Here is something that comes close to this, but not quite. Here is a sort of matrix-type simulation. This is a clip from Rick and Morty, where they play a game. And notice that within the game, almost all the beliefs Morty has are false. Okay? They are not actually true. But now the worry arises, what if we're in such a game? You can sort of see the possibility here of being trapped in some sort of simulation. Now, it's not, in a way, just a sort of weird philosophical possibility. Elon Musk says the chances we're not living in a computer simulation is 1 in billions. He's convinced we're all characters in some alien video game. And in fact, he's starting to spend money on research projects to figure out how we can break out of this. Now, that strikes me as a little insane, but here's another article. There's a 20% chance we're all Sims. And by the way, I don't trust this website. Here are some articles on the side, how to make love like a caveman. But here's another one. The Bank of America said there's a 20 to 50% chance we're inside the matrix and reality is just a simulation. I don't know, they might have a vested interest in this. So borrow the money, you'll probably never have to pay it back. It's just the game. Well, anyway. Here's another article, Elon Musk is wrong, we aren't living in a simulation. But whatever is the truth about this, there is this question you could ask, are we really in some kind of simulation? Are we trapped inside a matrix? And it's not an absurd idea. It could be the case that really we're stuck inside a sort of Life of Roy game. In my case, the Life of Dan game. And so we're playing this thing, and maybe at the end we'll wake up and realize, oh gosh, yeah, after all, the whole idea here is that he actually experiences something like the 55-year-long Life of Roy, and then all of a sudden he realizes he's there in the video game store. Anyway, not the video game store, the whatever it is, the Chuck E. Cheese type place. Okay, now, so what? Suppose there is an evil deceiver out to trick us. Suppose we are trapped in some kind of computer simulation. Suppose this life is really just like a video game simulation. What would follow from any of that? What kinds of recommendations do skeptics make? We've already seen that academic skeptics tend to be willing to make recommendations, and other kinds of skeptics don't tend to make recommendations. But they do say something. There's a reason why they make these skeptical arguments. Here is what Zhuangzi says. The true sage rejects all distinctions of this and that. He takes refuge in the Tao and places himself in subjective relation with all things. We've already seen that quote. Now, how can he justify that recommendation? Okay, just reject distinctions. Take your refuge in the Tao, which in Taoism is really just the way the world works. Just, in other words, go with the flow. Let it happen. Okay, there's nothing much you can do about it. Put yourself in subjective relations with all things. In other words, don't make any claims to knowledge, any claims to objectivity. Just say, well, it seems to me that blah, blah, blah. Or, gee, I like that. That's fine. But never say that really is such and such, because you have no basis for saying that. But of course, the questions arise. How can he justify such a recommendation? Does he know it? Does he know it follows from his thesis? Here is what Sextus Empiricus says. Sextus is a Pyrrhonian skeptic, somebody who officially makes no recommendation and thinks it would be inconsistent in order for him to do it. But he does say that, well, in a way he makes a recommendation. He says that all of this leads to suspension of judgment, which leads to peace of mind. Now, is he claiming that you ought to suspend judgment? That you ought to attain peace of mind? Well, no. He says, look, the skeptic can't know this, or even really assert it. I can't say knowledge is impossible, so you ought to suspend judgment. So you ought to just relax and have peace of mind. But, he says, even though I can't know it, even though I can't really officially even claim it or assert it, it just happens. So here's how he deals with this question of whether the skeptic can even articulate skepticism and make any recommendation on the basis of it. He says the skeptic had the same experience that's said to have befallen the painter Apelles. Once he was painting a horse and wished to represent the horse's foam. He was so unsuccessful he gave up the attempt. He flung at the picture the sponge, which he was using to wipe the paints off the brush. The mar of the sponge produced the effect of the horse's foam. You want to see what that's like? There. painting of a horse's foam. Well, okay, so he says the skeptics were in hope of gaining quietude, peace of mind, ataraxia, by means of a decision regarding the disparity of the objects of sense and of thought. And being unable to effect this, they suspended judgment. And they found the quietude, as if by chance, followed upon their suspense, even as a shadow follows its substance. So he's basically saying, I'm not saying you ought to suspend judgment. I'm not saying you will attain peace of mind. I'm just saying, hey, I was a skeptic, and it seemed to me that as a result I suspended judgment. And it seemed to me that, wow, suddenly I have peace of mind. I see Facebook friends arguing for Donald Trump, others arguing for Hillary Clinton, others arguing for Gary Johnson. I just say, who knows? And I just find peace of mind descends upon me. And I just say, oh, it's all good, okay? I suspend judgment and I find myself happy. And so he says, look, I'm not saying this is what you ought to do. I'm not saying this will happen. How could I know any of that? I'm just telling you, it seemed to me I did it, and it seemed to me that followed. Do I know that's going to follow for you? No, I don't know anything. I'm just telling you how it felt to me. Here is what Nagarjuna says in response to a similar kind of argument. Nagarjuna is a skeptic in the Indian tradition who attacks the Nyaya view of knowledge. And in the end, he says, yeah, look, if knowledge is impossible, how could we know the truth of skepticism? Wouldn't skepticism be unreliable or unjustified? And he says, well, if I put it forward as a thesis, then yes, sure. If I would make any proposition whatever, I'd have a logical error. But I don't make a proposition, so I am not in error. By the way, that's a pretty crummy argument. Because he's saying, you know, like, if it were raining, I would regret not having brought my umbrella. But it's not raining, therefore I won't regret not having brought my umbrella. And that's, I mean, you should think, wait, there could be other reasons for wanting your umbrella. So here too, maybe you're in error for other reasons, but forget that. The idea is really just, he's not putting this forward as a proposition. He's not claiming knowledge is impossible. He's just saying in the end, the skeptic must be quiet. So you say to the skeptic, well, you know, gosh, you've been giving me all these arguments to talk me out of my position, so what's your view? The skeptic says, well, I don't know. Right? The skeptic is like the person who said, you know who you ought to vote for? I'll give you all sorts of reasons why you shouldn't. But then who are you going to vote for, skeptic? Okay, I don't know. Okay, and it's that way with every sort of issue. There's a good question I'll leave you with. A question that one of my own teachers, Miles Bernier, raised in a famous article. Can the skeptic live his skepticism? Can I actually get through life while suspending judgment, while not actually making any knowledge claims? Can I really just put myself in subjective relations with things and just talk about what seems to me and get through life and act? Doesn't action depend on my having beliefs and on my making commitments? For example, why don't I just walk off the stage? It's because I believe there's an edge here, right? I'll get hurt if I walk off of it. Don't I have to have those beliefs? Well, one form of skeptic says, yeah, you have to have beliefs, but you don't have that knowledge. Another form says, no, you suspend judgment. All you say is, it seems to me there's an edge there. So I battle. Is there really an edge there? I don't know. I'm not committing myself. I'm not saying I believe it. I'm just saying I have this appearance, and I'm going to not pitch.